Welcome one and all to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Manhattan. My name is Pastor Isabel Call, and it is my joy to serve as the minister here. Our vision is to be a vibrant, inclusive congregation, widely known as a safe haven and a force for social justice. Welcome to any visitors here in the sanctuary and on Zoom. You will probably already have met our greeter, Kathy, or our Zoom host, Kathleen. Please ask any of us questions. I want to make an invitation for everybody to write down any joys or sorrows that you might want shared aloud later during the service. If you're here in person, you can find a piece of paper and a pen nearby for that, and if you're on Zoom, there will be a time later for you to type it into the chat. Today we're talking about the renewing power of conflict in our relationships. Conflict is a natural experience, a part of being on earth. For example, when we live together, there's friction when we grow or when we move. To prepare for our land acknowledgement, I tried a little bit to find an example of migrants coming to a place and approaching the residents there, the residents approaching them in a respectful way. Not necessarily conflict-free, but in a way where the conflict allowed both groups to learn and thrive together and live better than they might have had they not encountered each other. So I didn't actually find a story like that. But if you have one, I would love for you to offer that as a land acknowledgement some Sunday. In lieu of it, I want to acknowledge that we live, work, and worship on the traditional homelands of the Kanza and the Pawnee people, among others. And these are peoples who experienced conflict before the land was colonized, and I'm still learning those stories. During colonization, there was conflict, but there was also a lot of conflict avoidance. New migrants using their government and the military to fight and push people away rather than developing relationships. And so in that legacy and in this place, we gather to practice transforming conflict and building and transforming relationship.
No apples. My name is Sandy Nelson, and I'm the Director of Religious Education here. And this morning, do you guys want to come up and join or just sit there? That's cool. Isabel shared with me a story some time ago called, what did we settle on? Androcles? Androcles and the Lion. And I read the story that she shared with me. I thought, that really sounds like a kid's book that I know called Andy and the Lion. And wouldn't you know, this particular story is kind of in the other stories too. So as I read this, think about other stories that have this particular theme, as it were, or parts of it. Chapter 1. It was a bright day with just enough wind to float a flag, and Andy started down to the library to get a book about lions. He took the book home and read and read and read, and he read all through supper. And he read all evening, and just before bedtime, his grandfather told him some tall tales about hunting lions in Africa. Every story ended with, Then I gave him both barrels. That night, Andy dreamed all night long that he was in Africa, hunting lions. When at last morning came, Andy woke up and the sun was looking at him and through the window, and Prince, his dog, was tugging at the blankets. The lions had left his dreams, but Andy kept thinking about them. Andy thought about the lions on the back porch, and his father had to remind him to wash behind his ears. Andy takes a bath on the back porch. Andy was still thinking about lions after breakfast when his mother gave his hair a final brush. And Andy started off to school. Chapter 2. Andy's going to school barefoot. Andy walked along, swinging his books and whistling a tune. He came to the turn in the road and he noticed something sticking out from behind the big rock just at the bend. Looked very odd, so Andy and the dog, Prince, crept up cautiously to investigate. It moved. It was a lion. At this moment, Andy thought he'd better be going on his way, and the lion thought so too, and they ran and ran around the rock. Whichever way that Andy ran, there was the lion, and whichever way the lion ran, there was Andy. This looks like another story that I'm thinking of, where beings run around and turn into something else. At last, they both stopped for breath. The lion held out his paw to show Andy what was the matter. It was a big thorn stuck in his paw. But Andy had an idea. He told the lion just be patient and they'd have it torn out in no time. Fortunately, Andy always carried his handy-dandy pliers in the back pocket of his overalls, and he took them out and he got a tight grip. Then he braced one foot against the lion's paw and he pulled with all his might until the thorn came out. Looks like quite the tumble. The grateful lion licked Andy's face to show how pleased he was, but the time came to part, so they waved goodbye and Andy went off to school and the lion went off about the business of being a lion. This is chapter 3, but I'm going to have you hold on for a minute, okay? In the spring, the circus came to town. There's a lot of elephants in this picture. Of course, Andy went, because, that's what you do. He wanted to see the famous lion act. Right in the middle of the act, the biggest lion jumped out of the high steel cage and with a terrible roar dashed straight toward the people. They ran for their lives, and in the scramble, Andy found himself right in the lion's path. He thought his last moment had come. But then, who should it be but Andy's own friend, the lion? They recognized each other and danced for joy. When the crowd came back ready to fight the lion and capture him, Andy stood in front of the lion and shouted to the angry people, "Do not hurt this lion. He is a friend of mine." The next day, Andy led the lion and all the people in a grand parade down Main Street to City Hall, And there, the mayor presented Andy with a medal for bravery, and the lion was very much pleased. And the next day, Andy took the book back to the library. Okay, I'm going to put you guys on the spot, okay? Did you listen to the part where the grandfather gave the lion both barrels? But how did Andy deal with the lion? What do you think about the difference between those two? Anybody? He helped the lion. He thought the lion was just being a lion, right? Did anybody remember any other stories that are similar to this? Movies, other books? Anybody ever seen How to Train Your Dragon? Yeah. Milo, is it sort of similar? What happens in that How to Train Your Dragon? Does the dragon have a thorn in its paw? What does the dragon have that's a wing? He's missing part of his wing. It's even kind of a hand-like related thing. Anybody ever seen a movie called Shawshank Redemption? Isabel asked me, which one? The lion? Who's the lion in that one? I mean, Andy is obvious, right? Because it's Andy, it's his name. Who's the lion in that movie? Let's think about that. Shall we go?
Perhaps Andy is highly interested in lions because of his grandfather's aggressive attitude toward them. Or maybe it's in spite of his grandfather's aggression. Andy seeks out and reads a book about them, and then he can't stop thinking about them. But when he actually encounters a lion, his curiosity is overwhelmed by the fear that's baked in by his upbringing. He understandably misunderstands the lion's interest in him as aggression, but in truth, the lion needs help. What seems bound for conflict is transformed when Andy actually listens to the lion. Their experience together helps them create a new story of lion-human connection and helps them build trust. Later, when the same old story of aggression and violence threatens a new round of interspecies conflict, the lion and his little human are able to help others transform that conflict into celebration. It's important for us to think about conflict as members of a congregation. The UU Reverend Teresa Cooley, who literally wrote the book on it, says that even the most healthy and dynamic congregations experience conflict all the time. In a congregation, we bring our deepest values, our most vulnerable hurts, and our most tender aspirations. She continues, given that those are all deeply held individual feelings, it's almost a necessity that they would collide with one another at some point. So what do we do about it? First, Reverend Teresa says, we must accept that the evidence of conflict doesn't mean we've done something wrong. It means we have something to learn. Sometimes we've done something wrong, but it doesn't mean that it's unforgivable. Second, we must realize that if we feel ill-equipped to deal with conflict, it isn't because we are bad or needlessly afraid. It's because our Western white culture does little to teach us the skills of addressing conflict. One of the skills she teaches is the ladder of inference. And Kathleen is going to put a link in the chat for that. And if you're here in the sanctuary, you can find a picture of the ladder of inference in your order of service. When Andy encountered the lion, there were a variety of data that he might have noticed. But none of us can fully grasp all of reality at once. His selected reality was that there was a large, strong animal that he interpreted as aggressive. So if you're not looking at the ladder of inference, it starts with reality and data, then there's selected reality, interpretations. Andy made an assumption that the lion wanted to harm him, a conclusion that he would be harmed if he stuck around. And this could have led to a more ossified belief, like that of his grandfather, that lions are bad. In any case, Andy's action was to try to get away. The good luck in the story is that he couldn't. Once he wore himself out, he was able to perceive different data and come to a different conclusion. In congregational life, it's tempting to run away from potential conflict, but sometimes for various reasons, we're lucky enough not to be able to get away. Or maybe we have the presence of mind not to try. We sit down next to each other, nervous or exasperated, and notice the thorns in each other's paws. And all at once, everything looks different. By observing or listening to others' stories and creating a new story together, conflict is transformed and we are renewed, individually, as a relationship, and as a community. Rev. Teresa says that while it's crucial to walk down our respective ladders of inference, we shouldn't and can't go all the way down to reality. We're never going to be able to agree on the plethora of data, and it's boring and frustrating to try. Let's stay a few rungs up and tell each other stories. Stories help us convey what is even more true sometime than facts. They help us feel each other's experiences. Now, sometimes stories are not just based on selected reality. We all have a grandpa who brings in exaggerated facts or even outright lies to help us really get it. Stories are a way of sharing fundamental worldviews and communicating values and fears. For example, Andy and the Lion, I hate to tell you this, it's not a true story. As Sandy gave us sort of an alert to that. It's based on a fable. The farthest back I see it is in Aesop's fables, Androcles and the Lion. Does anyone actually know how to pronounce that? Androcles. I kind of like Androcles because it sounds like broccoli, but I'm going to try to say Androcles. So Androcles is an African man, in one telling, an African man enslaved by the Roman Empire around 2,000 years ago. In one beautiful adaptation written in the 1980s, I grew up with this on my shelf, he is mining salt in dark, narrow tunnels. And Lynn will read for us what Ellen Douglas has him tell his grandchildren. Oh, it's here. Why don't you use this?
Day after day, we hacked at the face of the tunnel. There was no way out, save by the way we came in. The bitterness of salt was on our lips, and briny sweat burned in the cracks of our lips and the cuts and scratches on our body. I grew weaker, for they fed us only enough to keep us alive. I remember catching the blind salamanders that live underground and biting their heads off and eating them. I knew I had to have meat. The day came when I knew I would escape or die. Now all my attention was on finding a way out. A few days later, as I was working alone, I heard the sound of running water. My resolve was born. Now, instead of working as slowly as I could to save my energy, I worked as fast as I could. But I spent only half my time picking at the salt. The other half I picked at the side wall beyond which I heard the water. On the second day, I made an opening. And by the third, I had made it large enough to crawl through. I made my long way across the watercourse, sometimes crawling for a long time. It felt like days. I slept and was awakened by the sound of moaning and growling to find that I shared a cave with a huge lion. I had come all this way to be eaten by a living beast instead of by the beastly state.
I think I have a few words.
I have one more. Technical difficulty here for a moment. The great creature crawled toward me like a sick dog, moaning and laying in front of me, biting and licking at one of its front paws, which I saw was wounded and swollen. And last, like a child, the lion lifted up its paw and gave a pitiful moan, held it out to me.
After Androcles nurses the lion brings him food, and they live together peaceably for several months. But eventually, the man wants to be among people again. Upon leaving the cave, he's immediately picked up by authorities, and now sentenced to be mauled to death by a wild animal an ocean away in the Roman Colosseum. That's the penalty for trying to escape slavery.
In my memory, I see the crowds in the high stone stands, a haze over the sand and light flashing, maybe reflecting off the jewels of the women. I have had a ball and chain that I'm supposed to use to fight the animal, and everyone in the crowd is expecting to enjoy the show. I decided as I stood there that I would furnish them as little amusement as possible. I sat down, drew my knees against my chest, wrapped my arms around my legs, bowed my head on my knees, closed my eyes, and waited for the animal to eat me.
Thank you. Of course, the animal that comes to eat Androcles, the one he's pitted against, is his lion, and it only comes up to him and purrs. The emperor, delighted, frees them both with a bag of silver, and they get the hell out of Rome. Well, they get as far as they could. Of course, the Romans are everywhere. But Androcles and the lion find an enclave of sanity, and they live out their days so that he can now tell the story to his grandchildren. So I seriously considered creating a dramatic reading of Ellen Douglas's version for our Time for All Ages. We certainly have some folks who would like to be a grandparent telling a story to their children, but I was sort of stumped on how to adapt it for folks as young as 4 years old. It makes sense that James Doherty's friendly circus version exists. You may also have heard of George Bernard Shaw's 1912 version for the stage, which makes Androcles and some other Colosseum prisoners Christian martyrs. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I understand that his preface is twice as long as the play and offers extensive theological background for his literary choices. We tell stories and we retell them. We circle back to them, add new elements, because we're trying to share our truths, the ones that are relevant for right now. The violence of trophy hunting, imperial slavery, and religious persecution need voice. When I say today that conflict is good or can be good, it can be renewing, I'm not celebrating violence. But I do believe that when we come face to face in conflict, the traumas of our ancestors raging in our flushed cheeks, it is a precious opportunity to be seen, heard, and healed. Storytelling through conflict renews and heals the world if, and only if, we do it faithfully. We have a fractured media landscape right now, and many stories are designed not to express truth, but to manipulate and obscure truth. And so we support public media. We seek out unbiased reporting, not just so that we can understand the conflicts of the world, but also so that these stories, these unbiased stories, exist for others to hear. And we invest our time and resources in community, where we learn and practice the arts of storytelling and story listening, truth telling and truth hearing. So I want to thank you and celebrate you, UUFM, for how you come here together with the gifts of your attention and your vulnerability. I want to thank everyone who financially supports the institution of UUFM, which is telling a story not just within these walls, but also beyond them, about who we are as Unitarian Universalists and who we are as Kansans, as Americans. We talk about that in order to open the minds and hearts of our neighbors. And I want to thank you for the ways that you open your minds and your hearts and allow yourself to be transformed by new data. Thank you for your fearlessness. It really matters. In one of the core texts of Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, it's written that, quote, until we had talked with complete candor of our conflicts and had listened to someone else do the same thing, we still didn't belong. Now, they don't mean that you have to publicly pour salt in your wounds in order to be a valid member of AA, but that the work of wrestling with our genius, did I say genius? I did. The work of wrestling with our conflicts, with trustworthy witnesses, that is, exchanging stories, is how we know we are part of the fabric of community. In 12-step programs, this work comes after thoughtless effort to identify our role in conflicts. It's really easy to tell stories about how everyone else in the world is doing things wrong, but conflict transformation requires us to reflect on our own agency, to understand ourselves as an active, unheroic character in our own story, to forgo writing propaganda about our pasts. Reverend Teresa brings this into congregational conflict transformation. She writes, the first task is to resist the temptation to completely blame others and look at our own contribution to the situation. End quote. We can notice we're in a reactive state if our breathing is all wonky, if we feel alligators or butterflies in our stomach, hackles on our back. Noticing and respecting my emotions in this state and choosing not to say something curt or not to send the novel-length email, that's my responsibility. And if I do blurt something out, then it's my responsibility to clean it up. I don't have to get everything perfectly right, and I keep learning that here. Don't have to get everything perfectly right, but if I engage in storytelling faithfully and faithful story listening, then trust builds all around me. We are able to do more complicated group projects without blowing up when we take the time to move through conflict. We trust each other enough to tell and live emotionally complex stories. Together, conflict renews us rather than destroys us. Sunday services can be incredibly moving when we access shared language and story that we develop over time with each other. And when we feel safe to feel deep emotions together. And that's how I define good worship. It takes a lot of intention and effort to create safe havens for this kind of experience. So it makes sense that 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings is the most segregated time in America. It's hard to build trust across difference. Unitarian Universalists value pluralism and interdependence, and we feel the need to develop intercultural competence and humility, not just because we like it, but because it's a matter of human survival. Humans are so often pitted against each other across lines of difference. Our modern Colosseum, one of them, might be the airwaves. Liberals and conservatives compelled to fight each other to the death. For whose benefit? For whose entertainment? And so I hear this longing, especially among those of us who are older and white and liberal, this longing for more exposure to people who are different from us, this despair that we aren't already sitting right next to somebody right now, somebody different. The magic of Androcles and the lion is that the lion showed up in his life by surprise. That moment of renewing intercultural epiphany is almost completely outside our control. Not completely, but we can't make it happen. We can prepare for it. We can go to the library and read about those who pique our interest, sure. But more importantly, just as importantly, we can show up faithfully to the conflict that arises right where we are. There are plenty of thorns in the paws around here. Let's hone our noticing skills, even in the face of someone who intimidates us. Maybe there's no one who intimidates you here in this space, but it's probably still an opportunity to hone our listening skills for the people we don't know as well. Let's practice our humility in asking for help if somebody wanders into our cave. Let's work together to listen for water and get the hell out of the salt mine. The rest of the story will unfold, I trust. So, for your part of the reflection, and maybe it's just a silent reflection, I'd like to ask you of a story, if you have one. I'm particularly interested in the history of this fellowship, of when conflict was transformed through listening, when you learned something you didn't expect through a conflict. So a story from this community or from your life, something that feels appropriate for sharing in this group, I know it's unrehearsed. Or maybe you will think about it and have a story that you think it would be useful for me or others to know at another time. So when has listening transformed conflict in a surprising way?